The jungle was oppressive, its dense canopy swallowing every sound the platoon made. Humidity wrapped around the soldiers like a suffocating blanket, their uniforms soaked and clinging to their skin as they moved through the underbrush. The air was thick with the sour stench of decay, mingling with the pungent odor of wet earth. Corporal Daniels could feel his heartbeat in his throat, a steady pulse of unease that gnawed at the back of his mind. They had been sent out for a simple recon, but nothing about the mission felt right. The radio had gone dead hours ago, and with each step deeper into the jungle, the sense of isolation grew. The buzzing of insects was constant, but beneath it, there was a disturbing stillness, an absence of life that made the hairs on the back of Daniel's neck stand up. Ahead, Sergeant McCall led the way, his rifle raised, eyes scanning the thick jungle with tense precision. Behind him, Private Mitchell whispered nervously, "Feels like the jungle's watching us." Daniels didn't respond, but he felt it too. Eyes, somewhere in the shadows. His grip tightened on his weapon, his senses heightened, as if the jungle itself was alive and stalking them. Each step felt heavier than the last. Suddenly, a rustling in the bushes caused the men to freeze. Rifles snapped to attention. "What was that?" Mitchell whispered. Before anyone could answer, something shifted in the distance. Just at the edge of visibility, a figure stood perfectly still. It looked human, but something was off. Daniels squinted through the foliage, his heart racing. As the figure stepped forward, it blurred, as if dissolving into the jungle before it vanished completely. The jungle closed around them, reclaiming the shadows. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Sergeant McCall motioned to move, but the tension in the air thickened, the feeling of being watched never fading. The platoon moved cautiously, their boots sinking into the soft jungle floor. Corporal Daniels couldn't shake the sensation that something was tracking them, an invisible predator lurking in the darkness. The jungle felt wrong. The rustling leaves and distant animal calls didn't ease his nerves. Instead, they heightened them, like a symphony of unseen dangers. Private Mitchell suddenly stopped, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely a breath. Daniels turned, listening intently. At first, nothing seemed out of place, but then faintly he heard it. Someone calling for help. The voice was weak, distant, almost like a wounded animal. A chill crept down Daniel's spine as he recognized the voice. "That's Lopez's voice," Daniel said, turning to Private Lopez, who was standing just behind him. The color drained from Lopez's face. "But I didn't say anything," Lopez replied, his voice trembling. The voice came again, this time from deeper in the jungle, and there was no mistaking it. It was Lopez calling out again. Daniel's pulse quickened. The men exchanged nervous glances, their knuckles white around the grips of their rifles. There hadn't been any enemy soldiers nearby, and nothing about the situation made sense. Whatever was out there wasn't human. Sergeant McCall broke the silence, his voice tense. "We need to move. Now!" The jungle had grown unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence that felt like it was closing in on the platoon. Corporal Daniels glanced at the men, their faces etched with fear. Private Lopez stayed close, his rifle gripped tight, his eyes darting nervously into the shadows, as though the darkness itself was reaching out to take him. Darkness fell quickly, casting long, eerie shadows across the jungle floor. The sun barely pierced the thick canopy, leaving the soldiers in a twilight that seemed endless. Sergeant McCall motioned for them to halt and set up camp for the night. No one argued. They were exhausted, both physically and mentally. As they settled in, the jungle remained deathly still. The campfire flickered weakly, its light barely penetrating the oppressive darkness. Private Jenkins, one of the younger soldiers, sat closest to the fire, his eyes wide and unblinking. "We need to get out of here," he muttered, his voice shaking. "There's something wrong. I can feel it." Daniels tried to keep the men calm, but the truth gnawed at him too. Something was out there. Something not human. They were being watched. No, hunted. Suddenly, a branch snapped in the distance. The men froze, eyes scanning the blackness beyond the firelight. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunched the leaves. "Who's there?" McCall barked, rifle at the ready. No response. The footsteps stopped, but something moved just out of sight, circling them in the darkness, as though taunting them. Out of the shadows, a figure stumbled forward, The firelight cast a dim glow on his face. It was Private Mitchell. His uniform was torn, and his skin was pale, almost gray. He swayed on his feet, as though he'd been walking for days. "Mitchell?" Daniels whispered, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Where the hell did you go?" Mitchell didn't answer. He took a few more staggering steps toward the camp, his eyes glassy, unblinking. As he drew closer, something about him seemed wrong. His eyes were hollow, lifeless, like a doll's. "Stay back!" McCall shouted, aiming his rifle. Mitchell's lips parted, but the voice that came out wasn't his. It was low, guttural, and twisted. "Help! Me!" Before anyone could react, Mitchell collapsed, his body twitching violently on the ground. The men watched in horror as his skin began to ripple, bones cracking and reshaping beneath the surface. "It's not him!" Lopez screamed, stumbling backward. Daniels felt paralyzed as Mitchell's face contorted, his eyes blackening, his mouth stretching unnaturally wide. The thing that had once been Private Mitchell let out an inhuman growl as its limbs twisted into something monstrous. The camp erupted into chaos. Sergeant McCall shouted orders, but the men barely heard him over the deafening growls and the rapid thudding of their own hearts. The creature that had once been Mitchell writhed on the ground, its body warping into grotesque shapes, limbs elongating, skin stretching as though ready to tear apart. "Shoot it!" McCall screamed, his voice breaking through the panic. Without hesitation, Daniels raised his rifle and fired. The crack of gunfire shattered the night, but the bullets barely slowed the creature. It shrieked, an otherworldly scream that pierced the air. The men opened fire, unloading round after round into the shifting mass. The creature staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it vanished, blurring into the darkness, disappearing as though the jungle had swallowed it whole. For a moment, there was silence. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the soldiers, their rifles still trained on the spot where the creature had disappeared. "What the hell was that?" Private Jenkins stammered, his hands trembling as he lowered his weapon. Daniel's heart raced. He had no answers. "That wasn't Mitchell," he muttered. "It's something else." McCall wiped the sweat from his brow, his face pale. "We need to move, now." But just as they gathered their gear, another voice rang out from the darkness. This time, it was Sergeant McCall's voice. "Help! I'm over here." The men froze. McCall was standing right in front of them, but the voice was unmistakably his. The jungle, thick with shadows, felt suffocating. Daniel's eyes darted toward the source of the voice, his hands trembling as he gripped his rifle. The others looked to McCall, who stood just as stunned. "What the hell is going on?" Jenkins whispered, panic creeping into his voice. McCall's face hardened. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice low and shaky. They moved cautiously through the underbrush, the jungle closing in around them like a living, breathing entity. The darkness swallowed up their weak flashlights, leaving them exposed to whatever lurked beyond. A crackling sound echoed to their left. The men whipped their rifles around, aiming into the trees. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate. "Don't fire unless you see it," McCall whispered, his voice barely audible. "We don't know what we're dealing with." The footsteps stopped, and the jungle fell into an oppressive silence once again. Private Lopez clenched his rifle, his knuckles white. "We should have been out of here hours ago." Daniels agreed, but there was no escaping the jungle. Not now. Whatever was hunting them wasn't going to let them leave. Without warning, a low growl resonated through the trees, sending a chill up Daniel's spine. It was deep, guttural, and wrong, like a predator's snarl, but twisted into something unnatural, something alien. Then the voice came again, this time closer. "Help! I'm over here." The voice of Private Mitchell echoed through the jungle, though the real Mitchell was long gone. Daniel's heart raced. The men exchanged terrified glances. "It's toying with us," Private Jenkins muttered, his voice shaking. "We're not going to make it out of here." McCall's face tightened, his jaw clenched. "We keep moving. Whatever this thing is, it wants us to panic. Stick together. No one breaks formation." The men nodded, but fear gnawed at their composure. Their steps were slower now, more deliberate. Every breath felt labored, every sound amplified by the thick, stifling jungle. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the faint sound of something moving through the undergrowth. The tension was unbearable. Suddenly, Private Lopez screamed. The men spun around just in time to see Lopez's body yanked violently into the darkness, his scream echoing through the jungle before being cut off abruptly. His rifle hit the ground, the leaves rustling as the jungle swallowed him whole. Lopez! Daniels shouted, rushing forward. The others followed, but when they reached the spot, there was nothing. No blood, no sign of struggle, just the jungle, silent and foreboding, as though it had devoured Lopez without a trace. Daniels felt the panic reach in his throat. Where did he go? Where the hell did he go? McCall scanned the trees, his rifle raised, but there was no movement. We can't stay here. Whatever took him is coming for the rest of us. The men didn't need to be told twice. They pressed on, moving faster now, their formation tighter, but fear gnawed at their minds. The jungle grew darker with every step, the path ahead twisting and turning as though it were alive, leading them deeper into the unknown. The jungle seemed to warp around them, the trees twisting into shadowy shapes as the darkness thickened. The silence following Lopez's disappearance hung heavy in the air. Every rustle in the leaves, every shift in the shadows, sent shockwaves of terror through the group. Corporal Daniels tried to focus, but the fear was suffocating, an unspoken presence between the men. He could see it in their faces, their eyes wide with dread, hands gripping their rifles so tightly their knuckles had turned white. Ahead, Sergeant McCall led them, his jaw set, though his eyes betrayed the fear gnawing at him. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the trees. It was Private Jenkins. Daniel's heart froze in his chest. The others stared, their rifles raised. Jenkins' uniform was torn, his face pale, but his eyes, those empty, glassy eyes, were wrong. Too lifeless, too hollow. Jenkins, McCall asked cautiously, his grip tightening on his weapon. Is that you? Jenkins smiled, a grotesque, unnatural grin that stretched too wide. His voice, when it came, was a low, guttural mockery of human speech. I'm fine. I found a way out. Daniel's blood ran cold. The creature had taken Jenkins' form. Before anyone could react, the figure lunged, moving with terrifying speed. The men fired, the crack of gunshots splitting the silence, but the creature twisted and blurred, its form shifting and warping as it moved. Bullets passed through it, barely slowing it down. Fall back, McCall shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Daniel stumbled backward, his heart racing as the creature closed in. Its limbs elongated unnaturally, its body contorted in ways that defied logic. It wasn't human. It had never been human. The jungle had become a living nightmare. The dense foliage twisted into shadowy shapes, the trees looming like giants as the creature stalked the remaining soldiers. Corporal Daniels, Sergeant McCall, and Private Thompson were all that was left, their bodies and minds battered by their relentless hunt. The Skinwalker was close now, its presence a tangible weight pressing down on them. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps as they pushed deeper into the jungle, trying to escape, but every step felt like they were running in circles. His legs burned, his heart pounded, and his mind screamed at him to give up, to surrender to the inevitable. We need to stop it, McCall rasped, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. We can't keep running. Daniels glanced at the sergeant, his face pale and streaked with dirt and sweat. McCall's eyes were wild, but there was a steely determination in them. He was right. They were out of options. The Skinwalker was playing with them, drawing them deeper into its web. They had to fight, or they would all die. We'll set a trap, McCall continued. It's expecting us to run. We make our stand here. The group moved quickly, setting up a small perimeter in a clearing, their rifles trained on the shadows. The jungle was deathly quiet, the air thick with tension. Daniels could feel the creature watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Minutes passed, and then they heard it, the sound of footsteps approaching, slow, deliberate. Private Jenkins' voice echoed from the trees. I found a way out. It's safe now. McCall's grip tightened on his rifle, his face grim. Hold your fire. Wait for it to show itself. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then from the shadows, the figure of Private Lopez emerged. His uniform was ragged, his face twisted in a grotesque grin. Why did you leave me? He asked, his voice a chilling mockery of the real Lopez. The men held their fire, their fingers twitching on the triggers. Then, with a sickening blur of motion, the creature lunged. Gunfire erupted, the crack of rifles splitting the air as bullets tore through the trees. The Skinwalker moved impossibly fast, its body twisting and shifting as it dodged the barrage of gunfire. It was no longer trying to deceive them. Now it was here to kill. Daniels fired until his rifle clicked empty. The creature's form flickered in the darkness, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it darted from shadow to shadow. It was everywhere and nowhere, a blur of monstrous shapes. Suddenly, McCall let out a scream. The creature had him, its elongated skeletal hand wrapped around McCall's throat, lifting him off the ground with terrifying strength. His rifle fell from his hands as he clawed desperately at the creature, but it was futile. With a sickening crack, the creature twisted McCall's head to the side, and the sergeant's body went limp. Daniels felt the cold grip of terror seize him as he watched McCall's lifeless body hit the ground. Thompson screamed and broke ranks, running blindly into the jungle. Daniels didn't stop him. There was no stopping this thing. Before he could react, the creature was on him. Its face, twisted and monstrous, shifted between the faces of the men it had already taken. Jenkins, Lopez, McCall. Their eyes were hollow, black pits, and their mouths stretched wide in unnatural grins. Daniel swung his rifle like a club, but the creature caught it effortlessly, yanking it from his grip. Its other hand wrapped around his throat, squeezing until spots danced before his eyes. The last thing he heard was the creature's low, guttural voice, a voice that sounded like his own. "Come with me!" With a final agonized gasp, Daniel's world went dark.